Welcome to the Desert Sanctuary with Karl and Laura Forehand.
Often when we have doubts about religion, or we want to be contemplative, or simply ask questions, it can feel like we are wandering out into the desert.
We would like to welcome you to our sanctuary, the Desert Sanctuary.
We've tried to pick guests that resonate with our fellow friends and seekers here in the desert.
Our hope is that you will find life for your body, soul, and spirit.
And now, here is our show. Hi, welcome to the Desert Sanctuary. We are glad that you are with us today. My name is Laura Forehand. I'm here with Karl Forehand. And before we get started with today's guest, is there anything you need to share with us?
Yeah, at the time of this recording, I don't know when this is going out, but we're just getting to the end of the Leaning Forward book. It's still being edited. I think edit time is about 5 times what writing is. So I'm just continuing to do that, trying to get recommendations from people and things like that. But as always, we encourage people to go check out the YouTube channel. There's 120 videos there now, including these podcasts that are now there. So lots of stuff there you can choose from, and I encourage you to do so. But that's not why we're here today.
No, we are here to talk to Dr. Darren Slade. And Dr. Darren Slade is a professor of history and comparative religion in Denver, Colorado. He specializes in the socio-political development of religious belief systems and is also the director of the North American Committee on Religious Trauma Research. Darren currently serves as the president of the Global Center for Religious Research and founding editor of the peer-reviewed academic journal, Socio-Historical Examination of Religion and Ministry. Welcome so much to the podcast.
Well, thank you. Sorry for the mouthful of the obnoxiously long titles, names to things.
No, actually, as I was reading your bio, this is all about me right now. So we're just going to turn the spotlight on me. Yours is the second bio that I've not messed something up as I was reading. So anyway, every once in a while, you just have to be like, hey, look at me. I did something and I did mess it up. So
Yeah, it would be worse if I did it. So
but
I
seriously get tongue tied every time I read a bio. So anyway, I'm going to turn the spotlight on you now. Welcome so much to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Karl and Laura. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. And so, Darren, we like to hear people's stories. I mean, no matter what background you come, if it's similar to ours or different than ours, we like to hear your story. So in whatever detail you want to tell us, please give us a little background, bring us up to speed, and then we're just going to have a conversation. Does that sound?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. And thanks for asking. Something that you have said before that I just absolutely love is just how sacred and cherished people's stories are. I think that's something for myself is a hard thing to learn. I am so academically minded and so task oriented that I forget about the people and the stories. And when I am teaching turning points in history, world history, something that to stress is the context of people's lives and the context of what's going on in the world and in society that would lead to major turning points. And we have a saying in my class that harsh conditions create harsh people. And that's a good explanation for a lot of the wars and genocides and slavery and misogyny and this and that. It was harsh conditions and people responding in like manner. And I think that is a good leadway into my own life. I grew up in horrendously harsh conditions, a broken home, abusive home. I had been kidnapped. I had been tortured. I had been abused repeatedly. And I did not grow up religious in any sense. In fact, I was barely exposed to it. And yet I remember, even as a little boy, I had found a King James Bible and just started memorizing it. I loved religion. I loved the Bible. And it wasn't until after high school, I have a mental crisis. I fall apart. I did not know it at the time, but I was developing really bad anger issues as a result of all the abuse. And that ruined a lot of relationships in my life. So I end up converting to Christianity, and it saved my life. I mean, it got me off of the ground of despair and suicide. And I became a zealot. I mean, I went crazy. And more became staunchly conservative, staunchly fundamentalist, right? Went down that rabbit hole. I knew I wanted to devote my entire life to God and to ministry, which alienated me from a lot of my peers, but also brought me into the world of the cult in a way. And I now see that I was, in fact, just being love bombed, and that I was, in fact, being entrapped by a cult, a Bible thumping cult. And that's when I had met my ex-wife, and every kind of the foundation of everything was religion and was God. I went to seminary. I was planning to become a pastor, start my own church, all that kind of stuff. And by the end of the first year of my PhD program, after having just consumed a ton of academic research and scholarship, I couldn't get enough. It became more and more evident that I was in a cult. I was trained to be a critical thinker, to be an historian, and to be a theologian.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty soon, it was my worldview and belief systems were just not measuring up, and it was falling apart little by little. So I was a closet atheist for a few years, and I don't want to just skirt over the transition. That was difficult and hard. Just gut-wrenching and painful. Losing my best friend, Jesus, losing all of these things that were so foundational to my life. And I fought like hell to keep my faith. And God just stopped showing up. So I was a closet atheist for a few years. And then when I was finally able and comfortable enough to come out publicly, my worst fears happened, which was that I lost everything. I became the scapegoat. I became the apostate. Wife took off, abandoned my daughter and me. Their family took off. No support system. And of course, this happened at the beginning of the pandemic. So now I'm isolated. I'm alone. I am trying to raise a daughter alone by myself. We just started GCRR, the Global Center for Religious Research, and everything is a dumpster fire. And it was brought to our attention that there's a burgeoning field of study called religious trauma that we don't have much information about.
Right.
And thinking about what was being done to me by my former faith communities, and realizing I might be a sufferer of religious trauma. Mm-hmm. We start digging in deep and diving in, and now the research and stuff that we're doing with it has just been incredible. And we're able to expose a lot of some of this stuff, and you wouldn't believe just how often I hear similar stories to what I've gone through. Yeah. The end. Yeah. Now we're here.
When you say cult, are you speaking particularly of Christianity? and I asked that question because that was part of my deconstruction, is really questioning, is Christianity like a cult? Because I see a lot of similarities between Christianity
Right.
and cults. I'm just saying. So,
Yes. It's a great question. Let's clarify. So just about anything can turn into a cult.
Absolutely.
For sure. Okay.
Sure.
And political and, or just even social activities can be,
Sure.
right? So let's get that out of the way. So yes, there's kind of an old saying that says, religion is just a cult that went mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
And when we think about cults of personality or new religious movements that are clearly brand new and clearly maybe going off the deep end, we think of things like maybe the Trump cult or Scientology,
Right.
Things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's evident and unmistakably a cult.
Mm-hmm.
Can things like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, are these things also cults? Or have they transcended it to become this, once something becomes so institutionalized and mainstream, does it cease to be that?
Mm.
And I don't know if I have an answer. What I'll tell you is that there are many of us historians, I'm one of them, that believes the origin of Christianity was a cult of personality. That if there was an historical figure named Jesus of Nazareth, that it was likely a cult of personality that developed around him, that went mainstream.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we see the same thing going on with Mormonism today.
Mm-hmm.
What was so evidently a cult of personality around Joseph Smith and the Brigham Young and the isolating of a community out in Salt Lake, things like that, it has now gotten to become so mainstream that it's almost taboo to continue referring to it as a cult. So I don't know. Is Christianity a cult? I think there's good arguments to say, yes, it is, and that it has started that way. My form of Christianity and the way I was practicing it was definitely cultish.
Gotcha.
So you mentioned here's your early life, and there was a lot of trauma in that early life. And then you come in that condition to Christianity, and what feels like salvation to you is common. I think people, that makes you, I guess you could explain this, but would you say that you're in that condition and you arrive at the doorstep of Christianity? You said you're love bombed, and there's always that initial thing like that. It makes, so just kind of explain how that works, or your understanding of that your condition led you to Christianity, but Christianity long term didn't fix that. It just brought you in, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in fact, by the way, we know from psychological studies, and this has actually been documented for probably a couple of decades by now, that the extreme conversion experience that people experience, where it's this life-altering change of worldview, and you get people who say that I'm on fire for Christ, right? And they become zealots. They deeply love God and Jesus, church, and their life is being changed, and their addiction is going away, and their problems in sexuality or whatever, and other sins finally curing. That lasts about 5 years. And we know from psychological studies that conversion experience and the life-altering change doesn't actually stick for long. Most people end up regurgitating or returning back to old ways. Mm-hmm. So it's a good Band-Aid for a minute that almost puts a cover on what's going on, the root problems of people's traumas and addictions and other things. It doesn't fix it. It just tells you there's a magic person in the sky that's going to help you.
Right.
It doesn't.
Yeah. A lot of bypassing. And so we're noticing out here on the fringes of Christianity, that's where the desert sanctuary kind of resides. We think of ourselves as kind of a booth out there in just outside of Christianity that's not trying to convert anybody to anything, but kind of being there for people. And out there we see lots of stories of trauma. But I also see lots of people moving towards understanding trauma, becoming trauma informed and all of that stuff. And you're part of that effort. So talk a little bit more about what you see going on in that area.
And if I could, I'm going to also tag this question onto it. Do you see religious trauma syndrome ever becoming part of the DSM or, something that is taken seriously within the medical community? So I'll just tag that onto the end of Karl's question.
Sure. Well, let me, I want to backtrack for just 1 second and say, going with the love bombing and that kind of stuff, when I was trained as an evangelist in seminary, I remember very clearly one book had talked about the 5 Ds of when people are most prone to convert. I don't remember all the Ds, but I do remember, 3 of them was definitely death, divorce, depression.
Mm-hmm.
And for me as a young man, I was going through my own version of a divorce from a long-term girlfriend and depressions. That is when people are most susceptible. And these are cult tactics that I don't necessarily think is intentionally, let's capitalize on people's misery. But it is well known that, religion is best when there's a problem to fix. Mm-hmm. But that's the problem. But then that also creates a problem because it doesn't actually resolve anything or solve anything until pastors and those in professional ministry come to become trauma informed and realize that their ministries, their teachings, and just the community itself can and does often cause trauma and can compound the problems that got people inside the church in the first place. Right. So I don't want it to sound like I'm anti-religion or anti-Christianity or ministry, nothing like that. But we don't have people who are well enough informed of what the potential problems that they're causing. When you tell people that their depression is demonic oppression, or that their addiction is the devil, or that all you got to do is pray away your anxiety and depression and stuff. Mm-hmm. No, you are potentially harming people to the point of life and death, suicide type of stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
So religious trauma syndrome, we do not like the word syndrome being attached to it.
Okay.
And this is because it's not a syndrome. And it actually can create some stigma and everything. So I just want to clarify that. We just call it religious trauma.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because religious trauma is just trauma. There's nothing different about it than what you would get if you were in combat scenarios and PTSD, or like with me, complex PTSD, years and years of exposure to violence and abuse, or a severe car wreck, just trauma. Except religious trauma happens within a religious context. So the trauma is being perpetrated specifically because something related to religion. Could be a doctrine, or it could be, a pedophile priest, right? I bring that up because, no, I don't think religious trauma will ever be a part of the DSM, and I'm not so sure we should want that.
Okay.
Because we already have trauma in there. And we don't want to make this, that we don't want to pathologize religious trauma to think that it's a genetic defect, like something with a syndrome, or that it is something so far unique that a regular trauma therapist just simply couldn't do it. No, a trauma specialist in EMDR or somatic treatment can and do help with religious trauma. I feel like I also missed a question in there. So what did I miss? And does that answer part of it?
That answers my question.
Yeah. So
perfectly. Thank you for clarifying.
What do you see going on the fringes it just seems like everybody I talk to is studying religious trauma and things like that. And some of them are becoming trauma coaches and, things like that. What do you see? What do you hope? And maybe tell us a little bit more about GCRR or any other things you got going on.
Yeah, sure. It's hard. There's something called a spotlight effect, I think it's called, where you are so enmeshed in a particular field that you think everybody is talking about and everybody is right. So it does seem like there is a growing awareness and movement to this. And I like to think that it is in fact happening and we're helping push the movement forward. I don't know if it really is as big of a deal or as broadcasted as much as it should be. And I say that because, one, there still seems to be a lot of stigma around the notion of even having trauma, let alone religious trauma. And if somebody were to say, my gosh, I've been hurt by God, I've been hurt by my religion or my faith or the people in my faith community, am I going to piss God off? Am I going to get him angry? Am I a sinner for doing so? So there's still a lot of taboo. On the converse, the world is dramatically changing and becoming less religiously affiliated, less dogmatic. And that is allowing people the freedom to step back and say, I might still believe in something. Hell, I may still even consider myself a Christian, but I don't need to adhere to what my forebears and what the religious right used to, has drilled into me. We do see as a whole institutionalized forms of Christianity and religion in general are plummeting. Church pews are emptying. Churches are closing at an exponential rate. And churches are breaking up at an exponential rate and splitting up. So I think that as that organically comes to an end, the institutionalized forms, I think people will be able to become more aware of the trauma that was perpetrated through the institutions.
Yeah.
I think that's true because when we were inside the church, I didn't realize how, traumatized I was being or re-traumatized I was becoming until, I had to step out of the church and that's when, I really was like, okay, wow. Just things happening. And when you said prayer, that's a real big one of mine, God just not showing up kind of thing. So yeah, I think inside the church, it's really hard to see that. And once you step outside and really start evaluating things. And I think that's all we, Karl and I are trying to do is just kind of let people know, like, it's okay to evaluate, and if you still want to go, that's great. If not, like, there's a reason. So, yeah.
A lot of people directly out experience kind of a PTSD, just an awareness that, man, something was wrong back there. And now I'm feeling it. Then when they began to take some time and be by themselves to go inside, they encounter that shadow or the deep wounds. And we began to say, just like we did a couple of days ago, we've done a lot of work, but there's still something even deeper there. And we want to work on that some more. So,
I want to turn the question to you though. So, because you're working with a lot of current and former believers and people who are still, you're being exposed to a lot of people still showing up on Sunday mornings, I presume. What is your gut telling you? You probably have a finger on the pulse a little bit better than I do. Are the churches are people leaving? Is it becoming a big news that people, even staunch believers, are coming to an awareness?
I see them paying attention more, kind of at a distance, and beginning to really evaluate. And I know that in our former churches, we had 3 churches over 20 years, and none of those adults have come back to us, hardly at all, just a few. But most of their children have, and most of their children are listening on Facebook and the places we post and so on, and they're still there, and they're for the most part pretty decent human beings and most of them don't go to church anymore, but they're not like us, where we just can't go sit on our porch and get better. We have to interact with people, and we want to help people and those kind of things. We see almost everybody that comes out has some sort of PTSD, and certainly an identity crisis. Who am I? Who am I? What do I do now? What do I believe? The fear of, am I going to go to hell for doing this? So we see all of that. But then we're trying to pinpoint through interviews and so on, well, what are the things we hear in common that everybody does? And we wrote about that in the book we're just getting ready to put out. And the common things, above all, were things like authenticity, going inside, learning to trust myself, because I couldn't trust myself in religion. It was always, that's evil, that your inside is evil. It's things like that. So we see people facing their trauma, and usually they find it's a lot bigger than what they thought, and it's going to take some time. It's not, I'm not going to get a magic formula that I can share with everybody else. But people seem to be getting that, and I think the interesting part of it is, you see, even out here in deconstruction land or the desert or whatever you want to call it, that, paths cross and people grow at different levels and different, at different speeds. And even Laura and I aren't always in the same place at the same time. But I would say any my whole take on it is any organization is pretty similar to the church. The organization always comes first. It spends most of its money keeping itself afloat and keeping the trains running and all that. It has very little time for your problems. You won
time or training. No training to deal with your problems either.
That's right. Exactly. And, it's it's real hard. I've written several things on, it's hard to get better inside the church because it's an organization. Anyway, I don't know if I answered your question or not.
I think so. I'm sure you're also are seeing a major generational gap here, where the older generations, kind of on par for what's expected, have the most resistance to it, to the notion that religion can and does cause trauma. We get a lot of hate mail and nasty comments and stuff, which is actually kind of fun to read sometimes, but it's almost always almost always older men, who kind of have the mindset of, oh my gosh, really? What other things are we going to whine about? What other things are we, can you not just pick yourself up by your bootstraps? Do you have a scraped knee? And I'm actually somebody of that similar mindset. I'm not a whiny kind of person who thinks that we ought to complain and cry about every little thing. But religious trauma is in fact impacting significant amount of people.
Yeah.
I'm sure you are aware, we just put out the world's first most exhaustive sociological study on religious trauma. And what GCRR discovered is that 1 in 3 U.S. adults have had religious trauma at some point in their life, and 1 in 5. We estimate at least 20% of the U.S. adult population currently suffers from debilitating symptoms of religious trauma, multiple symptoms. And so I guess I want to ask you, what are some of the common things that you are seeing people are saying cause them trauma, and what are some of the symptoms that are manifesting?
Well, I probably haven't heard as much as you have because you're really busy on Facebook and I'm not. I think for me, it's just, I hear a lot about just the contradictions of the Bible, or, just how, for me, I'll just speak for myself. For me, the trauma comes a lot from the fact that I never felt like I was doing enough. How did I know I was doing enough? So if God didn't answer my prayers or whatever, then it was my fault, and so that's the kind of thing, those are the kind of things I hear, probably because that sounds very similar to what I kind of dealt with. So, for me, that's what I hear mostly. I'm not sure what you hear, because like I said, you're on Facebook a lot more and chatting with people a lot more than I am.
I think one of the things that, what's his name? Robert Augustus Masters talks about is spiritual bypassing. And I think that was one of the biggest things. I can't ask questions. We just don't have time for your questions. So I can't ask questions, even though those are nagging. Another big thing is that, I almost forgot what I was going to say. God has a plan and a purpose for your life. And in all my years as a pastor and the years following, when you really get down to the bottom of it, most people don't know what that is. They all tell me God has a purpose and a plan for my life. And I can't find it. I keep showing up here every Sunday to find it, and he doesn't tell me.
And that's when the gaslighting happens, because obviously you don't have faith, or you're not, you're not in prayer enough, or you're not in whatever, I mean, it's such a vicious cycle to me. It just goes round and round. And like, I just got to the point where I had to jump off. Like, I just literally felt like I was going crazy.
Yeah.
Because you just keep going round and round and you're not going anywhere.
So when God's being an asshole and not telling me what his purpose is, then I get swept up into the pastor's plans and purpose and the church's plans and purpose. And as long as I'm a doer of the word, not just a hearer, then they're happy with me because it's all volunteer labor. Plus, I give them 10% of my money and all those kind of, I just think.
It's a pretty good gig. Think about it.
My first book was called Apparent Faith, What Fatherhood Taught Me About the Father's Heart. So I was looking at God through a father lens, and I said, he can't be a worse father than me. But most of the stuff that we believe and kind of go along with is abusive.
Yes. Oh, yes. The cliches and the things that we were taught and even preached from the pulpit. If they were applied to a human being, a husband or a boyfriend or a spouse, man, we would say that's some codependent, abusive stuff right there. That sounds gross.
One of the things we were kind of wrestling around with in the new book, there's a few doctrines that we're just kind of wrestling with, not saying anything definitive, but is worship. Worship, if I would kind of transfer that to a father, there were things I could do for my son that he couldn't do for himself for a long time. I could provide stuff. I could help him when he got hurt, or I could get him out of situations to a certain extent and so on. So I could do things for him. And I would hope that he would be grateful. He'd say, thank you, but I in no way wanted him to worship me. If I made him bow down to me and thank me, or I'm never going to bless him again, that makes me a worse father, not a better one. And worship seems, nowadays I'm more inclined to think of that kind of thing as communion, not worship. If there's a God, then can I be in connection with him or her? So connection is closer than friendship or anything. Yeah, you can't get closer than being connected. And so being connected is enough. And a good father would know what I want anyhow. So,
yeah. Well, yeah, you guys are touching on exactly what we see a lot of as well. I hear shame, guilt, and a loss of your core identity, or not even being aware of who your identity is, because it gets so absorbed into the faith, into the worship, into the God. And that's exactly what we're seeing across the board as well. Our study had showed that we studied 6 major symptoms of religious trauma, but that wasn't the main. There's clearly more, but these 6 ones pop out the most. And our top is anxiety, and then stress, fear, depression, shame, and nightmares, all related to teachings or behaviors within the religious community. And, you talk about spiritual bypassing, which is wonderful, where people have been conditioned, indoctrinated to use their spirituality and their faith to completely mask and hide uncomfortable emotions and to mask the trauma that might be inside of them, or whatever's going on with them. I remember my first exposure to the church was a health and wealth prosperity gospel church, big mega church in Denver, Colorado. And it was always said, you want money, you need money, give us money, give God money, right? Just take a step forward and sacrifice. It was always said that the words and thoughts, the words you speak, the thoughts you think, direct your life. Very much this manifesting your own stuff, but on a more Christian note. And so I just recall all the time going in and feeling horrible for whatever reason, not necessarily because of God or church, but other things, and having to put on a big show. I would put the big smile on, and when somebody would say, "How are you doing today, brother?" "Oh, God is good, brother." And it was across the board. It was everybody. Nobody was real.
Right.
Nobody was authentic.
right.
And my goodness, if you weren't prospering, if you weren't succeeding, or you weren't getting over your anxiety and depression, if you couldn't stop having premarital sex, you don't have enough faith in God.
Yep.
You're not standing His word correctly. You're doing something.
Right.
Guilt and shame. Absolutely. Across the board.
Yeah.
And you mentioned fear. I think what we did kind of subconsciously, no one ever told me as a pastor, well, a guy my professor taught me how to preach over lunch on a napkin. That's how I learned to preach. And then I started doing it. But nobody told me to use fear in my sermons. But I think subconsciously that just you kind of realize after a while, that's what works. Any sales pitch that can get you to fear can sell you whatever they're selling. And that's the same way with the sermon. So I think one of the things that's hard out in the desert is what we call it. But out in the desert, for us, one of the hardest things is to live without having something to be afraid of. It's, well, who's the enemy? Brene Brown calls it common enemy intimacy. Who do we hate? Who's the bad guy? And I've even deconstructed my idea of Satan. So now who am I afraid? Who am I afraid of? And it's like what almost the Bible was trying to get at a few times. Who should we fear? Yet fear is a part of everything religious. And so I think that's another real big key thing, that it's one of the things you mentioned.
Well, even if we're not getting the fire and brimstone sermon, right? repent or you're going to burn. The fear can come in a more subtle way when the preacher stands up and says, you are nothing without Jesus, that he should be your entire core identity, that everything going on in your life is the result of God. And if it's the devil doing something, God's allowing it, or God has a plan, right? These types of things will automatically instill some fear, because when life goes south and bad, which it inevitably will,
Yeah.
people don't know how to explain it outside of these spiritual terms, which offer no comfort, and almost start to always direct the focus to, what did I do wrong? What's wrong with me?
Mm-hmm.
And, I even think about where we're trying to get, where some have tried to not instill that same fear. And they say, look, if you're going through hardships in life and trials, the devil is scared. He's just putting pressure on you because God's got something good. Hang in there, right? And for a little bit, the perseverance comes and it's good. But what if the plan never manifests? What if there is no shiny pot of gold at the end of that trial?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it offers platitudes. It offers kind of showy, unhelpful things. And that's the real issue.
I have a question. I don't know if this kind of goes with what you're talking about, but in all your research that you've done, do you see that people who have had maybe childhood trauma experiences, such as yourself, are they more inclined to experience religious trauma? Because that's something I've been looking at in my own life. Like, was I not that, that's not to give churches a pass. That's not to give religion a pass. But was I just more susceptible to that because of some trauma that I had in childhood? If that makes sense.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I don't know if I have any empirical data with it. However, I'll tell you this. Why do we see abuse victims continue to return or date the same kind of people, right? The battered wife who still finds wife beaters to date, right?
Yeah.
We're creatures of habit. And what happens, especially in childhood trauma, is that our brains are neurologically rewired for survival mode. And so for those who are consistently exposed to trauma and abuse and violence as a child, we start to live up here in a state of fear and anxiety and survival so much that this becomes our baseline. When other people, the baseline's way down here. When this is your baseline, then of course you are going to gravitate and even attract people who will be consistent with what you know growing up. So it may very well be the case that those who were abused as kids instinctually go towards high control, authoritative environments like a cult.
That makes a lot of sense.
And I could even see it being where people who don't have their trauma, worked on, if they're existing up here and they get into a relationship where the baseline is down here, something feels off. Something isn't right. And it's uncomfortable. So even that can make it go south for them.
I wonder sometime if, I don't mean this just in a flippant, derogatory kind of way, but being a pastor for 20 years, there's always that little saying of, who can I tell? Who do I talk to? Who can I trust? Plus all the standards and practices that are just normal that bypass and so on. So I wonder sometimes if all pastors could benefit from taking a couple years off, get better mentally, psychologically, if we wouldn't all be a lot better off. I'm not just trying to say, well, all pastors are crazy, but they, as much as anybody, don't have a way out. All I can do is if I try to work, sometimes when I try to work on this and I try to think about some different things that might be causing this, I could get fired for doing that. Give up my livelihood, which is eventually what happened to me. I was bivocational and had other income, but I had to give it up because I couldn't wrestle with that and have a congregation at the same time. So I sometimes call them kind of flippantly the toddlers in charge, because they're still reacting to stress at whatever level they were traumatized. And they don't, number one, understand trauma, as you mentioned before, and they're not getting better. So how could they tell us how to get better? And I think it's a problem that keeps proliferating itself. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And there's an interesting dynamic in which it causes conflict among professional ministers, from archdioceses and judicatories and just to the congregational level. Is the stark difference between those who are genuinely passionate about their faith and they feel called by God to preach. But the calling is no good substitute for actual training. And so many of them might go to seminary and get a theological degree, but they have zero training. I mean, hell, they go to seminary and get a pastoral counseling degree. That does not qualify. That does not count to be able to handle the messiness of what's going on in people's lives. But they think so. So inadvertently, they have great hearts. They actually are servants, and they want to do good for their community.
Yeah, I agree.
But they don't have the skills and training for it. The other thing, though, that I find interesting, this is a saying that I started using a while back, is that religion, and I'm going to say it's more than just religion, politics, law enforcement, religion, lawyers, these occupations tend to be petri dishes for creating toxicity and attracting the wrong kinds of leaders. We do know that a sizable portion of people who get into ministry aren't there for the right reasons. And I hate overusing narcissism. Not everybody's a narcissist, but occupations like law enforcement or being a pastor and a priest, or a politician really do attract narcissists and abusers. And because they tend to be charismatic personalities, that gets confused with having a divine calling to lead a flock. So there's also that dynamic, and you'll never get them to step down. They receive too much attention and praise, getting them to step away.
Donald Trump, Mark Driscoll,
Carl Lentz.
I mean,
Carl Lentz. Yeah.
Name them.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. There's some great, quote unquote, great examples of that in our society right now.
Yeah.
Can you tell us some more about GCRR and your things you got going on?
Yeah, what do you have going on there? That's so fascinating to me.
yeah.
So first of all, what does it stand for? What does it stand for?
Global Centers for...
Well, I mean, I was going to have him tell us, but anyway, go ahead.
No,
I can show you how smart I am.
It's our marriage
so it
in
doesn't
real
look so
time.
shameless for me. Well, I'll preface by saying our website is gcrr.org, and it stands for the Global Center for Religious Research. We, in terms of things like religious trauma, we currently offer a 32-hour certification course that is designed for people in professional ministry, for clinicians to get their CEUs or continuing education units. And it's also designed for people who are survivors and sufferers of religious trauma, who want to know more about what trauma is doing to their brain and their body, some of the environmental and theological context that can create religious trauma so that we can maybe prevent it, and the best treatment options and best ways to alleviate, mediate, and eventually cure religious trauma for your own personal life. So that is a big thing for us. And all you have to do, if you are interested in more of that, you go to gcrr.org/RT, R as in religious, T as in trauma. But more than that, GCRR hosts international academic conferences throughout the year. We have international conferences on religious trauma, atheism, the historical Jesus, interreligious dialogue, all those kinds of things. And we also we have a peer-reviewed academic journal called SHERM that publishes oftentimes groundbreaking new stuff, diving into the psychology, anthropology of religion, or just ministry practices, right? And then, of course, we have GCRR Press, which is our big book publishing platform that publishes some of the latest research as well. We have a number of great things to help with just theological or political or sociological stuff. So definitely check us out. We actually have our foot in a lot of areas, and it's really exciting. We have researchers all over the world, an international board of directors, international board of scholars and editors. So we're doing a lot of wonderful things.
So I have a follow-up question to that. So do you have very many clergy, like people that are currently in churches that are seeking out your certification program? And a second question to that is there a way that you all are like trying to reach out to clergy? Because I think that's, like we've been talking about this whole time, I think that's so important that people become trauma informed in the church. So two questions there. Do you have a lot of clergy, and do you do is there a way that your organization reaches out to them?
Yes and yes. Absolutely. In fact, we partnered with a number of denominations to where their clergy can get even discounts to the program. Awesome. And if any listeners want to know more about that, all they have to do is just email us or go to our website and do the little chat thing on us. But our email is info@gcrr.org if you want to learn more. But yeah, absolutely. We partner with several denominations and bishops, and very much have a lot of religious leaders who are very much interested in wanting to prevent religious trauma from happening in their congregation. So kudos to them. And we do, of course, advertise to them and reach out to them as well.
Sure. Well, I'm glad that you do.
Yeah.
Because I mean, we can talk about it all day. We can talk about the negative, or I can, about the negative effects that, church has had on me. So I think it's awesome that, your organization is actually reaching out so that in the future, if the church is going to survive, hopefully it'll be way healthier than it has been. So, yeah.
That's the goal. I may be an atheist, but not everybody at GCRR is, and they're in no way anti-religion. There are mental health benefits as well. But the chronic problem of religious trauma needs to be stopped, and people need to be aware of it. So,
yeah,
absolutely.
And people that have done some kind of deconstruction or some, become enlightened or whatever you want to call it, they, even if they're going back into religion, they tend to say the transformation is not going to come from within religion. It's going to come from the outside. And so I don't know if that's true or not, but I do notice that the church hasn't changed much in 1,500 years. So they show me some signs of life. I'm not not.
The church needs to change if it wants to survive, and it actually wants to do any good. Otherwise, I get asked. I get asked, well, what if the church believes in hell and really does want to talk about it and stuff, or what if there are core things to their identity that they don't think they can change? How can they survive, or what should they do? And or do you have any advice for them? And I just say, well, if it's working, go for it, I guess. But I'm willing to bet it's not. I'm willing to bet your congregation is less than 20 people and is dying, and you'll be closing the doors soon.
Yep.
So it's change or die. I don't know.
I'll blame it on the world and do some introspection and figure out what's really the problem.
Exactly.
I always think about other, other forms of employment or whatever. Okay, I'm a teacher, but I constantly have to do reflective work like that. I mean, if something didn't go right, I just don't go, oh, well, I'm just going to keep doing that. I mean, and I have evaluations for my principal and things like that. I have observations, and it's like, I think, if church is going to be that business model, that might be something that needs to be part of it, like do that in introspective work like you were talking about.
We just saw the Barbie movie last night. There's a couple of points in the Barbie movie that would help it said something like life is hard and life is change.
Yeah.
If you don't realize that, you got some issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I saw the Oppenheimer movie yesterday, and the debate was, do we go see Oppenheimer or do we see Barbie? I'm so glad we chose Oppenheimer.
I've heard that's a really good movie.
I think it's going to win Best Picture. That
really?
Was unbelievable, but long. It's the 3-hour movie. But anyway, yes, the existential crisis happening in both plot lines in both movies is very relatable to what's going on in church. Yep. Absolutely. Now the key is, can you get the narcissist or the petri dish toxicity to do the introspection and reflect and say, yeah, maybe there is some room to change here. That's the hard part.
That's the hard part.
Sure.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This has been a good conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah. I have to say, Laura is an ATN fangirl.
Attachment and Trauma Network. I don't know if you know about them, but
which would be Janine, and Janine McConaughey and some people like that.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So
that's great.
So we love conversations like this,
we really
especially
do.
Laura, who has a psychology degree, loves them. So anyway, we thank you so much for coming on, for taking your time on Sunday to come visit with us, and maybe we'll do it again someday.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'd like that. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
For all the listeners out there, we do appreciate you tuning in. Thank you for valuing these stories like we do. For spending time listening to the podcast. We greatly appreciate it. But as always, be where you are, be who you are, and be at peace.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary.
Remember, all that wander in the desert are not lost. We hope that you know
you are seen,
you are heard,
and you are loved.